Thank you very much for joining us. We'll get to your thoughts on the Labour Party conference. You don't have to be here this year. You're a lucky guy. You get to stay at home rather than your 5 years at the coalface. But let's talk about cost of living. Those two cliff edges coming up this week. Let's go through them each individually. The end of furlough, of course, that finishes on Thursday night, at the end of September. Been running for a very long time. Around 1 million workers are still on it, we believe, according to ONS figures last week. 40% of them fully furloughed, the rest on furlough part-time. Do we have any idea how many of them will be able to return to full-time work immediately, or how many will be left without a job?
So we don't know is the absolute truth, and actually lots of the workers involved may not know themselves what their future is beyond the end of the furlough scheme. So there is significant uncertainty. What we do know is that the numbers flowing off furlough into unemployment will be much lower than many, including ourselves, were fearing last autumn, when the Chancellor obviously was talking about bringing the scheme to an end long before we'd got the vaccines rolled out to give us, a potential end in sight for this crisis. So we're in a much better place than we would have been with plans to bring it to an end much earlier, and it's done its job. Unemployment in this crisis has been lower than many expected, and it's been lower than previous recessions. So that's all good news. But yes, for the people who are still on it, particularly actually some older workers, and if we look at who's been coming off the furlough scheme over the reopening since the second lockdown, young people have been coming off it much quicker than older people, particularly off full furlough into some work as we reopened the hospitality and leisure sectors. So I think there is some risk of older workers who were placed on furlough not coming back, maybe some of those going into unemployment, but others may end up in early retirement.
Right. So, your best bet is, I suppose, maybe only tens of thousands or even 100,000 or so left without a job by the end of the week.
I think we should expect low hundreds of thousands experiencing kind of some form of change in their labour market status as we see the furlough scheme end. That's a significant number, but it's not millions. And lots of those will go into other jobs. But yes, some people will face a difficult autumn, particularly, as you mentioned, because those that then do need to rely on benefits won't get the more generous level that people are currently receiving.
Well, let's come to that. The other argument about, of course, the end of the furlough scheme is the government quite keen to tell everybody is that job vacancies in the labour market, of course, have been at a record high, over 1.1 million vacancies in the market. So a simple calculation might suggest anyone who is left without a job when furlough ends could be picked up by the labour market. Is it that simple?
No, because human beings and the labour market aren't like it's not like switching the lights back on in the restaurant to get workers into the restaurant. You need people in the right places. They need to want to do those kind of jobs. They need to be able to fit it around their family life. So just simplistically lining up vacancies with numbers flowing off furlough doesn't work. And there is a slight danger of them. Look, why are there large numbers of vacancies? It is because this crisis is so unusual. We turned our economy off, and then we turned it back on again. And turning it back on again is actually, with anything, more complicated than turning it off, because it just takes time to get people to where the new jobs are, or even where the old jobs are. And so we shouldn't be surprised that that's taking time to work through. Within that, and that's what you can see happening, for example, in the hospitality sector, within that you've got some really acute shortages, and obviously the one we're all focused on rightly is HGV drivers. And that's because of this combination of this general issue about how the economy has been turned back on, not just here, but around the world at once. But it's also obviously because the effect of COVID has been to turbocharge some of the change in migration, numbers of migrant workers in the country that Brexit was going to bring anyway. And that's just brought to a crunch what's been blindingly obvious was coming since at least 2016.
Okay, let's talk about universal credit. Obviously, that also expires. The £20 uplift expires at the end of this week as well. Now, there is this government plan, isn't there, that does seem to be looking ever more concrete. Therese Coffey's idea, the Department of Work and Pension Secretary, to ease the taper rate from 63p down to 60p. In other words, 60p in every pound is taken away from your benefits when you go back into work rather than 63p. And that will effectively allow claimants to keep something like £11 a week of the £20 being taken away from them. You would presumably welcome that as a fairly good idea.
Well, I think a lower taper rate in the universal credit system is a good idea, because despite what lots of people think, it's actually the lowest earners in the country that actually face some of the highest marginal tax rates because of the combination of the benefits and the tax system. You can easily end up paying 70-80% of the extra pounds you earn in either lower benefits or in higher taxes if you're a low-income household. So I think that does make sense. But I think we should be really clear that changes to the taper rate aren't the same thing as keeping the £20 a week. The vast majority of benefit claiming households will still be much, much worse off. And in particular, the poorest bits of the benefits of the universal credit population will not benefit at all from any change in the taper rate, because obviously you need to be earning money for the taper rate to benefit you. In fact, you need to be earning quite a bit of money in some cases. So it won't benefit the poorest members of our society, those that the government's own policy says aren't expected to be working because of either their health circumstances or young children or other reasons. So I think we should separate the conversation out. Is it a good idea to have a lower taper rate so that low earners have a good incentive to increase how much they earn? Absolutely, we should have been doing that long before this. But the actual basic rate of unemployment benefit and wider universal credit levels are just too low for people to live on. That's what this crisis has made absolutely crystal clear, and you can't solve that by changing the taper rate.
Okay, let's look at the whole thing around then. The end of furlough, the end of that universal credit uplift we just discussed, but also rising energy prices, rising oil prices, which means more on petrol and diesel, rising inflation, Bank of England saying that's probably going to stay at 4% for a little while. And that means, of course, the spectre of rising interest rates. And, of course, there's the new social care tax rise next April. That's an awful lot coming down the line, potentially. Have you had a chance with your planet-sized brain to add up how much this is going to cost in the round for your average taxpayer?
Well, luckily, there are other people with much bigger brains in the Resolution Foundation, so they've done quite a lot of number crunching on what would happen to different households, and clearly it is very different for different kinds of households. But the big picture is, one, it is going to be tough for families in general. Two, it's going to be a living standards crunch, particularly focused on low and middle income Britain, because although the price rises will be fairly shared, will be kind of pretty broadly shared, and almost everyone will see elements of them. The income falls being focused on poorer households is what makes this living standards crunch so big and so worrying this autumn and winter. In terms of the numbers we're talking about, I think if the rising prices will more or less wipe out the increases in earnings, even for people seeing quite large increases in earnings, for example, because they're on the national living wage, which the government is doing a good job of increasing at the moment and will increase again next April. But the price rises between now and then will basically mean that benefit is wiped out for those low earning workers, and most people aren't. I know the headline figures show very high earnings growth at the moment, but that's mainly due to statistical anomalies. So most people will see price rises that are faster than earnings growth over the coming winter. And then if you're a poorer household in particular, two things will happen. One, your income will fall as well, and it will fall a lot. And actually, the income falls from the universal credit are much, much bigger for the households affected. It's about 5% of their income being taken away in just a week's time on average, than the increase in national insurance will mean, although that will affect a much broader range of people. There we're talking about people's income falling by maybe 1.4% as a result. So these are really big changes to income and changes to prices at the same time, and that's what makes it such a difficult winter.
So the government would argue, of course, that they're doing their bit to try and alleviate all this when they can, but effectively this is just a one-off post-COVID and indeed post-Brexit adjustment. This is the economy trying to screech itself back to normal, and eventually over time the wages will go up and people won't feel this cost of living crunch for very long. How long do you think we're potentially looking at here for real income losses for people? Is it just a few weeks or a few months, or is this long term?
So I think that we should split that into two halves. So I think the government is right to say that a lot of what we're seeing right now is the very unusual circumstances of reopening an economy during a pandemic. And, we've been calling on people to pay more attention to that, particularly unique dynamic to this crisis for some time. And that is what is feeding through into some of these price rises. And it's particularly because we are coming out of the pandemic in lots of bits of the world at the same time. Not all, because the developing world is obviously not having a vaccine-induced recovery in the same way that the developed world But broadly, large parts of the global economy are switching back on, and that is having the effect. And I think the government is right to say most of that, particularly if you look at what's happening to gas prices, is temporary, although it's still very significant. I think though the government is overreaching. I've heard the Prime Minister a few times, and actually Grant Shapps this morning saying, "Oh well, look, there's fast earnings growth going on, so actually people won't feel these cost of living pressures." I think that is wrong, because if you step back, we should be really careful about kind of claiming silver linings to how this pandemic unwinds, because the big picture is that this pandemic has made us all poorer. It's made us poorer as a country in terms of what we can expect in terms of tax revenues, and it will make us poorer in terms of our long-term income. So the lasting effect, even when we get through this bumpy phase, and I think some of that bumpiness should be seen as temporary, but the lasting effect is that we will be poorer, because huge economic crises do have lasting damage. Maybe this one, it shouldn't be as big, for example, as the damage after the financial crisis. Nothing like, but it will still be with a negative sign in front of it, not a plus sign. So I think there's a bit too much silver lining talk out there.
Okay. Torsten, let's turn to Labour conference. You, of course, used to work for Ed Miliband. You were his head of policy for 5 years. I note that Keir Starmer's announcement this morning of taking away charitable status from private schools and giving them a £1.7 billion tax bill instead was something that Ed Miliband pointedly didn't do when he was Labour leader, or didn't propose doing. Did you look at that when you were working for Ed?
I think the idea of reviewing the charitable status, or particularly the tax implications of how private schools work, has been around for donkey's years. I'm sure you've read about it in different phases of your career as well, Tom. So it's been around, and it would have been looked at, and it's something. It is hard to justify the status quo. So I don't think it's surprising that a Labour government would come to look at that. As you say, it's also been a fixture of Labour policy over the last few years as well. So I don't think we should be surprised that that Keir's coming forward with it. Obviously, it's harder to do in practice, because obviously some of these you're talking about converting charities into businesses or into social enterprises, and that's not totally straightforward to do. But I don't think we should be surprised that this kind of thing's on the table. I mean, if you look at how the role of private schools has been changing in Britain over time, they've been moving away from competing for lots of British students and moving into the international market. That's how they've managed to maintain themselves over the last decade or so.
Why did Ed do it then? If this is a simple, normal thing, obvious thing for Ed Miliband to propose and you to suggest to him.
The honest answer for Tom is I don't know. You're stretching my memory beyond its elasticity. So I can't remember. I mean, the discussions about this kind of thing were around, so it's not like it's. But I mean, the other thing is the way Labour policy making has gone. Just a lot more stuff gets announced these days. You'll remember the 2019 manifesto was rather full. If you just look at this Labour conference, there's just a lot of policy being announced. Even today, we've got new fiscal rules from Rachel Reeves. We've got new proposals on whether you tax private schools. You've got, I think, Ed Miliband himself talking about later today in his speech, setting out announcements in the green space. So there's just a lot. Whereas in the olden days, you probably would have had one big policy story to make sure that somebody actually heard it today.
And a big conference rabbit in Keir Starmer's speech, perhaps. Would you expect that? Some real defining policy that we can all remember him by on Wednesday?
I think that does seem to be, given what I've just said, seems to be where we are heading. I mean, and that's understandable, and all Labour leaders want to announce big policies. You remember, in fact, down in Brighton itself, Ed Miliband announcing the energy price freeze, which some people thought was communism at the time and is now Boris Johnson's flagship policy, protecting households from rising prices this winter. So I think we should expect something. Obviously, yeah. I mean, if I step back and say, what is the public looking for from Keir Starmer right now? I would be sceptical that it actually is on the policy side. I think they want to see, leadership in some of its other forms in terms of empathy, connection, charisma. And the speech also needs to deliver on those things.